Welcome to Voices Carry, a podcast series hosted by Jim Giebutowski, CEO of Marketing Messages, a global voiceover services firm, and his wife, Janet Kraus, a Boston-based startup CEO and former professor of entrepreneurship at Harvard Business School. Jim and Janet interrupt their life of marital bliss to discuss how professional voiceover plays a critical role in creating a brand-affirming customer experience for businesses, from pizza shops and auto dealers to multinational corporations with global call center systems featuring languages spoken around the world.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Jim.
Glad we're doing another one of these.
Yeah, why not? The last one was so fun. Let's do it again. So I'm back talking to my husband, Jim Giebutowski, owner of Marketing Messages, and they are a global voiceover services firm based right here in Boston, actually kind of next to Harvard Business School where I used to teach.
Yeah, that's right. I went there too, many years before you, of course. Would have been fun to have you as a professor, actually.
Yeah, that would have been fun.
Well, I have to say you're pretty smart about this stuff. You've picked up on voiceover pretty quickly.
Well, thank you. So let's get into it. Last time we talked about why it's important to use professional voice talents for recordings so that they match your brand. What's our topic for today?
Well, today we're going to go global, and it's actually quite simple. If you can create a great caller experience in English in the United States, and if voice is important to your brand, why not create the same great experience in any language?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. When I was teaching at HBS, we talked a lot about global branding and how if you're global, you need to think globally but act locally. So that would seem like an obvious requirement.
I think you're right about that. And what I want to do today is really talk about the challenges of multi-language recordings and what the minefields are that you can run into, and also go over some tips and ideas for how to address them. But let me start with the main headline. And that's, if you're not talking authentically to your customer in their native language with a native speaker, you're going to lose trust, you're going to lose credibility, and potentially you're going to lose sales.
So it's more than just getting the right English voice for the brand. It's getting the voice talent who speaks the language that the customer speaks. Is that right?
Right. Absolutely. When you think about it, if you're an Italian caller and you're calling into a U.S. multinational, do you want to be spoken to in Italian or English?
It's a tough one. I think I'm going to go with Italian.
So would I. And I think the reason is people buy from people that they trust, right?
Sure.
And people trust people who they connect with, and people connect with people who really speak their language. So I think it's really that simple.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I speak in Portuguese. We'll talk about that later. And I find that whenever I'm somewhere and I just start speaking Portuguese, immediately there's a connection that you wouldn't have expected.
Right. I mean, when we go out to restaurants, I've seen you with the waiter just like very naturally, and all of a sudden he feels like he's being connected with.
That's right.
So that makes a lot of sense. But there's also a data piece of this too, and there's been a number of studies on this. One was from actually two companies. One is called ICMI, who folks in this call might be familiar with, and Lionbridge.
And I'm not. So who are they?
So ICMI is a call center professional development firm, and Lionbridge is a consultant. Now, I know from your professional background, you've actually done a lot of both, so you'll believe them, right?
I think so. Let's hear what they have to say.
So the study said that 74% of consumers are more likely to buy from a company a second time if the after-sales support is offered in their language.
That makes sense. We just talked about connection.
But at the same time, 79% of contact centers actually service customers whose first language isn't English.
Seems like an opportunity there. So I remember that you mentioned that Marketing Messages has special expertise in multi-language call center deployment. Is that right?
Yeah. And what we do is we work with a whole broad range of customers, from small companies all the way up to Fortune 500 companies who are trying to do global branding in over 80 languages. So we have one customer that actually doing 30 languages for concurrently in their call centers in all the regions around the world. But we have other customers as well who are just doing English, Spanish in, say, a North American environment, and they're doing it to expand the people that they want to reach, and also in some cases, particularly like healthcare, trying to reach underserved communities.
So where we live, it's not far from a community of Brazilians. And I think this is what you're talking about. They speak Brazilian Portuguese. And so if I were a small company in that area, it might behoove me to actually have it be taped in Brazilian Portuguese. So I think what you're talking about is an example kind of like this. Where we live, we're not far from a big community of Brazilian who speak Portuguese. These are the people that I often talk about speaking with because I lived in Brazil. And so if I owned a bakery, it probably would behoove me not only to have it be in English, but also to have it be in Brazilian Portuguese. So shall I do it?
Yeah, try. I'd like to hear you do it.
I'll give it a try. I hope it's good enough. You Brazilian Portuguese native speakers, please forgive me, but I'm going to give it my best. Você ligou para Janet's Bakery. Para muffins, tecla 1. Para bolos, tecla 2. Para trazer para casa comida que engorda para o gym, tecla 3. That last one was bringing home some fattening food for my darling husband, Jim.
That was fantastic.
I don't know if it was fantastic, but it was fun. I tried.
Well, I don't know. It sounded almost as good as our Brazilian Portuguese talent, Pippa. And, I find it interesting because I was actually sent a map of the United States. And on the map, there were, for each state, there was a language that was the most spoken language other than English, Spanish. And there must have been 25 different languages on that map.
Yeah.
It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, no, I mean, so in here, where we live here, it's Brazilian Portuguese. But if we were just to go down the road like an hour, my Portuguese would be not exactly right, because that's where actually in Rhode Island, there's a lot of Portuguese from Portugal. And it actually sounds pretty different.
Right, absolutely. And you've got, Vietnamese in Texas and German in South Carolina. But the thing is, doing this in multiple languages across the board, across the world is a really, really hard thing. And that's what we're really good at. What we find is many companies take shortcuts. They'll do things like, they'll take their call center agents, try to convert them into voice talents. Or they'll, even worse, try to find somebody that they know, right? So
like me.
Right, exactly. Right. And it just so happens that they don't have the skill set. And that's fine if you're, if once you're doing it for one voice recording in one language, but think about doing that if you're doing it across 30 different languages.
Yeah, it quickly gets complex. I can imagine it being, in many cases, a disaster. In fact, I remember you saying last time that a call center applications required a higher level of voice talent, that there were more moving parts than other voice work. So can you give us a little bit more understanding about what it is about multi-language projects that make them so challenging? Okay,
that's a lot to talk about, and I think this is a good time to transition into the minefields. So we have a production team, and they've seen it all. They've seen every minefield. They keep a bottle of vodka in the studio just to deal with the minefields they run across. But I'm going to focus just on the really big ones, the 4 that really, really blow up projects.
Okay, so there are 4. Which one are we going to step in first?
The first one is around voice talent choices. Now, remember, voice talents are very hard to find, and it's really easy to compromise if you're under the gun. So just don't compromise. The place to start is just make sure that you find a native speaker who records in the countries where the recordings will be heard. So think about this. Spanish. Spanish is spoken in
almost, it's so many places.
Right.
And what about French? Obviously, you have Canadian French and French from Paris.
And we're back to Portuguese again. By the way, how would you sound in European Portuguese if you tried it?
Well, as I said, if I were heading down to Rhode Island and speaking European Portuguese, they'd peg me as an American who spent time in Brazil, who is now, trying to speak Brazilian Portuguese Portuguese from Portugal. I don't think I'd get by.
Right.
And then, of course, if I was in Africa and trying to speak Portuguese, that'd be a whole nother Portuguese.
Right, exactly. And, we find Americans make this mistake all the time. We worked with one global tech company, and when we went in there, they had chosen a talent that was from Birmingham. But the company was based in London, and they had a specific brand that they were trying to put out there. And they weren't happy with the result. It was just a mismatch between the accent and what they were trying to convey. And what was worse about that is, you've got the soccer rivalry between the...
Get soccer rivalries involved in England. on top of the sound of their voice, you got a problem.
Right, exactly. So we find that happening all the time, and it happens in almost all different languages.
So what about the recordings themselves? What is it that makes a great voice talent for languages other than English?
Well, you need a great voice, but we look for some of the people skills in this. So we're looking for people who are reliable, they're timely with their deliverables, and they're non-defensive when it comes to feedback. So one trait that we see that's really important with the voice talent is patience. This is a art as well as a science, but there's detail and discipline that are involved in this. So, for example, you have no patience.
What? Me? That's ridiculous. I have all the patience in the world.
All right, well, let's test this. So could you sit in a booth all day long from 9 to 5, just going through audio clip after audio clip and keeping the same style and pace and consistency and paying attention to every single detail and do that all day long?
I can barely sit here long enough to do this. Are you kidding me? You're right. I am not patient, but you are not either. So let's be fair here.
That's true. But, that's one piece of it. I think the other piece is you need to have good English skills as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, if you're discussing scripts or, the nuances, which we're going to talk about, it could be very important that they have good English skills.
Right. And if you're trying to resolve a translation issue, if you can't speak English, they don't speak both languages.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing. And we need people who are voice talents who are committed to the business. So some of these systems, or most of the systems that we put together in a call center environment, have lives of 5 years or more. So if you record one way in 2021, you have to keep that same style and consistency and pace through 2026 and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, you've had voice talents in your lineup for decades even, and they managed to keep exactly the same voice, the same pace, the same nuance. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Now, the next question would be, where do you find these voice artists, and how do you work with them if they're spread all around the world?
Well, it used to be that they would come into the studio in Boston. They were transplants who came over, and they're native speakers, but they live in Boston. But now we've gone to more of an in-country approach. They're recording in the country where the native language is spoken. And what we found is that doing that overcame some problems that we had back when we were doing it locally. The first thing was they lose their accent if they're here for any length of time.
No, I can imagine being around Americans all day. They just sort of lose just the edge and possibly like cultural nuances.
Right. And those are the things that can be picked up by a native speaker very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. The other piece is you can, if you have somebody who's speaking in country and they're set up in their homes, they can record quickly as opposed to them having to come back into the studio. So we can do what we call pickups very, very quickly if we're in that environment. Well,
I'm going to ask even though we've been living in a pandemic and pretty much everything is virtual right now, I'm going to ask the question anyway. Is it harder to work with people when they're not in the same room? And I know that people must have some kind of sound equipment or sound booth for this. How does that work?
Yeah, it's a different environment, but what we really find is that we can do it just as effectively remotely. And part of that is just technology has evolved to make it a lot easier. So what we do is we define standards for their equipment in studio, and we have them get the equipment, and we coach them to make the environment standardized to our specs. And that's important. But the other piece of it is we actually vet these talents pretty tightly. So for any given voice talent we bring aboard, we'll actually listen to 5 voice talents at least before we make a hire.
So you're kind of having like the American Idol or The Voice for finding your Brazilian Portuguese speaker.
Yes, exactly. And we do have judges. We coincidentally have 3 judges.
And let me guess, you're Simon?
We rotate that role, actually.
Good. Nobody could do that all the time.
That's right.
So that's a lot. It sounds like you've put a lot of thought and a lot of energy into how you hire for voice talents. That's what your value add is, or one of it. Mm-hmm. Can we talk about the next minefield that we're going to step in?
Yes. Let's talk about scripting. The most important thing with scripting, or the biggest minefield we run across, is companies not vetting the script with everyone involved in the recording at a detail level. So this is a minefield on top of a minefield. Think about if you're doing this for, let's just say, a large call center where there's 10 different languages involved, it's important to be accurate in English, but even more so in other languages, because you need to convey the intent within the cultural context of all these different languages. And one particular challenge when you're dealing with the U.S. multinational is, what are the things that you speak in English versus what you speak in the native language? And that's really important for a call center application in particular. So, example is company names and brand names. They're most of the time spoken in English. But what about things like locations or websites or email addresses? All of this has to be agreed upon, not just with the telco people, but also with the marketing people who care very much about the brand.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's a lot of complexity. I bet you have an example to break it down for us.
Yeah, I think the best one is, we had a printer manufacturer that we worked with recently, and when we went over their script, and we were in a review session, and they had told us a story about what happened when they tried to have voice talent speak a particular URL or website address. Now, they were doing this in Spanish, French, and Arabic. And I'm going to speak specifically to the URL. The URL was www.worldwidebank/cashkey.com.
Okay. Names have been changed to protect the innocent here, I assume?
That's why we're calling it Worldwide Bank.
Worldwide Bank.
Right.
Generic worldwidebank.co. Okay. And what happened?
So the French voice talent recorded, and it came back, the word worldwide came back in French.
Okay.
Then in Arabic, worldwide came back in English, but cash key came back in Arabic.
Okay.
And then the Spanish came back with the dot voiced as punto, which we actually recommend that they do in Spanish, but the rest of them didn't conform to that. So it just became very, very inconsistent. And that's one of the things that can kind of set back a project, because then you have to go back and re-record.
Oh, yeah. Can you imagine if you did that in 30 languages? It's clear then you just can't pass the script from the customer to the voice talent without going through all these details. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. And it's just a collection of a lot of little things.
Stuff
right?
that you may not know if you were trying to do it yourself.
Right. And the biggest area around this is around pronunciations, because pronunciations, we don't speak English, so we can't always vet everything that comes through. So you have to really be engaged with your customer on this. And a lot of the work that we do are around high consequence events. So think about medical equipment instructions or stock trades or legal disclaimers where you have to get all the words right.
And I can imagine, because you've done some of this, you wouldn't want to get a drug name wrong.
No.
And certainly, I remember when you went to CVS and I asked for Zyrtec and you got me Zantac. That's kind of, one of those things that would be problematic.
I don't think I'm going to ever live that down.
No, probably not. Sorry about that.
Keeps on coming back.
I've got allergies, darling. Can you get me Zyrtec? Zantac? Anyway.
But it's important. And one of the things that we do is we make sure that the scripts include very specific phonetic representation of each of the words that we think could be mispronounced. And we're really, really picky about syllables and consonants, right? Hard G's versus soft G's, the way that you say an A or not say an A. In fact, what we've done is we've set up what's called a pronouncer hotline. So if you think about it, if you're a Czech voice talent, English may not be your first, it isn't your first language. And it may not even be your second language. So you might actually pronounce or misinterpret the pronouncer itself. So we have people call in and say the word in Czech, and then we'll just pass that along. Client will say it, and then we'll pass it along to the voice talent. And that makes it a lot more accurate. And there's one company that we work for. The company's called Biogen. They're a biopharma company. And think about the word Biogen. You can say, if you don't know the language, you might pronounce it Biogen or, Biogen, for example.
Sure. If you didn't know it, there's lots of ways you could say that word.
Right. And we had a project where we had to have this voiced in 6 different Eastern European languages, and it came back literally in 4 different ways. Stan is the head of our production department and
goes, oh my God, if we had just figured that out beforehand, which is why that's what you do now.
Exactly. So I think that's a good point to bring it to the next minefield, and that's professional translation. So What you don't want to do is not use a professional translator. It has to be a pro, not a friend, not a colleague, not a language student, somebody who does this for a living.
And I'm betting you're also suggesting no online translation services.
It's probably the worst mistake you can make when it comes to translation.
I think I get this. For fun, sometimes the girls and I will just take a sentence in English and put it through the translator to, say Turkish. And sometimes you really don't want to know what comes out the other end.
Yeah, no, I've overheard some of these sessions, and it's pretty bad.
It's funny when it's in your own home, but I can imagine it's kind of a brand embarrassing moment.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's a brand killer. And we've had to do many, many re-records because folks have used automated translators. And fixing translations is really enters in a lot of inefficiencies into the process. So one of the excuses we get for not having us do the translation is, well, all of our stuff has to be approved by legal.
Yep, I can imagine that being a obstacle.
Right. And it's, we have to keep this internal because we have controls on it. And so what happens is, let's just say it's an application that requires a recitation of a data privacy law. These things are really, really long. And so if we're doing this in one case, we're doing it for, again, 30 different languages, it could come back wrong in a whole bunch of different languages. So what happens is we record it, it goes out, mistakes are picked up, we have to go back, retranslate, and this circles itself. We call it the circle of death.
Oh, God, that sounds like a merry-go-round. How many times did you have to do that one?
I think that one we did like 4 times or 5 times. And we really don't like doing that multiple times. I mean, people have to pay for those recordings. And, in one sense, it's, great to have the money, but we really would rather just keep it cost efficient for our clients. So we place a pretty good premium on making sure that everything is perfect before it goes into recording.
And I'm sure that now that you have that example in your bag, you can share that before the company goes down that path. You don't want to have to do this 4 times.
Exactly.
So everything goes back to getting the script right the first time.
Right. The script's the rallying point. It's the same. It's the common piece of music that everybody sings off of.
So if we've done voice talents, we've done script, we've done translations, what else? I bet it has something to do with people, because people are usually in the mix.
And that's the great thing about your background is you always bring it back to people, which I think is great. And it's certainly relevant.
Well, if there were no people, everything would be super easy.
Well, we wouldn't have a business, right? So, but yeah, it's being collaborative in your process. I think the biggest, again, this brings us to the last minefield, which is not engaging your organization early and often with one standardized process. And part of that, or the beginning of that, is really identifying all your stakeholders up front. So we do, literally millions of transactions globally when you think about where these call centers are played. So you need to get involved or have technology involved or IT involved, but you have to have marketing and customer service and operations involved as well, because this impacts the business. So one example of this, we went into work with a consumer electronics company, and oftentimes what we'll do is we'll go over what was done on the previous project before we were involved. And they had recorded in 10 different languages. They had tried to take this on themselves. And so they got the English, they translated it, and they just literally just sent it out without talking to the business. And when the recordings came back, you had websites spoken in English, some spoken in other languages. Then there was some mention of a product that had been actually put on hold because there was some violation of environmental laws and we didn't know about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was another product that had yet to be rolled out, and they went ahead and voiced it. They weren't ready to introduce the product.
Wow. So that's one of those minefield on minefield on minefield. And how did it get resolved?
Well, it didn't get resolved because the way you resolve it is literally to record everything all over again.
Got it. So what's the best way to do this in the future?
Best thing to do is to record in English and then have everybody listen to it.
Got it. Yeah.
And then, are there business issues? Are there technology issues? Are there voicing issues? Get all of those things up front. then go back out to all the languages. That works a whole lot better. And I think it gets to the point of making sure the process is standardized across the board from beginning to end, from voice talent choices to the point where you're approving the pronunciations before they go to the voice talent. All of that is very, very important. And you even need to have a process for resolving disputes, because we've seen these things devolve into a shouting match.
What shouting? You guys, I mean, these are voice talents. That's pretty hard on voices. You get into actual shouting matches?
It is. We had a global banking client that was involved in a project, and this particular guy was being sworn at in French and other languages over one single phrase. And the phrase was, it's a simple one. It was, a customer service representative will be with you momentarily. So there's all these differing views on how that one term or one sentence could be said. And there was no process. So you have to have a process for figuring out, what's the right way to say something and how to resolve those issues.
I mean, this is a good podcast. I mean, we've got drama. We've got climax. I didn't know we're going to have drinking and swearing. Holy cow. Voice talent and voice recordings. It's more complicated than I thought.
It's like anything, right?
Yep. People are people.
They are. And, organizational dynamics are important. I mean, you're an entrepreneur. You know the value of, making sure everyone's going in the same direction.
Yep. And that's why you do what you do so well. I think I'm getting it. I'm going to summarize. So if your CEO gave you 60 seconds to tell her or him what you need to make your multi-language call center recordings totally successful, swear-free, and without drinking, what would you say?
That's a great summary, actually. A great question. What I would say is, don't do this yourself. Hire a professional voiceover firm to do it. And there's really three reasons for that. One is we have a lot of experience doing this, and we've seen all these minefields. We know how to get through them.
You've got battle scars. You can avoid the minefields for them.
That's right. And again, we talked about standardization and consistency. I mean, think about this. If it would be a total nightmare if you had individual voice talents doing this, different scripting, different practices, different audio standards. That's a disaster. And then just think about the efficiency, just the administrative part of managing all the pieces.
Totally.
So that would be my advice at the end of the day.
All right. That is good advice. We've covered a lot of ground, but I do have one final question. What would be the most fun global voice project you can think of?
That's a great question. I think it's something that would involve travel. Maybe it's something that you and I can do. How about doing voice work for the World Cup or the Olympics?
Ooh, I'm kind of liking this. You got music involved. You got cheering involved. This sounds great.
Yep, and we can go to all the soccer matches around the world.
Jim, football.
Oh, right. Football. It's football. Sorry about that. And what are those horns called in Brazil?
Vuvuzulas.
Vuvuzulas,
That's right. So anything we've missed?
No, I think we've covered it. I mean, the way I look at it, all these projects are like snowflakes. They're all different. So you'll need help up front. So just call us as early as you need to. Chances are we're going to fix things you haven't seen because, we've seen it all.
You've seen it all around this virtual world.
Doesn't matter if it's Bengali, Navajo, or Icelandic. So we're here to help.
All right, Jim. Until next time. Now, I just have one last question. Do I get paid for this? Or is it possible you're going to cook me dinner for like 3 weeks?
Well, I hate to cook, but you did a great job. So we'll see.
Ooh, lucky me.
So anyway, always fun to do this with you, Janet. See you next time.
See you next time.